This is the Chicago Loop, the most iconic elevated rail line in the world. Forming a rectangle in Chicago's downtown, the Loop is a crucial part of the Chicago L, as it serves 8 stations, 5 lines, and 40,000 riders daily. A relic from the 19th century, it also provides breathtaking views of the city, both as a passenger on the train and as a pedestrian traveling underneath the tracks. However, it was not always this way. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, amid decreasing ridership and its outdated infrastructure, the Chicago Loop was public enemy number one of city planners. In plan after plan after plan, there was an appetite to replace the L's with a subway.
At that point, the idea of the subway, which would ease the congestion on the roads that were growing by the day, was very alluring.
But unlike other US cities, Chicago chose to save and rehabilitate the Loop. So what exactly happened? And what does the future of the Loop tell us? This is why the Chicago Loop is still standing. The Chicago L looked very different when the L's first opened. In the early 1890s, there were 3 companies operating elevated lines in Chicago. These elevated lines would then terminate outside the Loop because it was expensive and politically infeasible for the private companies to individually do so. Because that was inconvenient, a businessman named Charles Tyson Yerkes proposed a loop system. Trains would come into downtown, loop there, and then head back out to the outer neighborhoods. And Yerkes was the perfect person to do this, as he yielded a ton of political power, which was necessary to build the loop.
Yerkes was a private enterprise person. He was a businessman, a tycoon, both liked and disliked at the same time because of various factors in his persona. But there is no denying the fact that he was singularly responsible.
This is Dr. Sriraj. He is a professor of transportation at the University of Illinois, Chicago for more than 20 years. He is also currently the director of UIC's Urban Transportation Center, which extensively researches and proposes solutions to many transportation issues in Chicago.
He spent the money, he constructed the L, and invited the private rail companies to start using the L. And it all happened in a few short years.
And with Yerkes' involvement, the loop was completed in 1897. With this new loop, passengers can now enjoy a one-seat ride into downtown while also enjoying the views. However, this arrangement was a little too successful. Ridership surged and the loop now faced excessive train traffic. To make matters worse, because the Chicago Loop was built in the 1890s, it had all the problems associated with that era of railroad planning. Sharp curves? Check. At-grade junctions? Check. And small stations that were always overcrowded? Check. The cherry on top to all of these problems was another train line, the North Side Main Line. Opened in 1900, it allowed rapid transit access to the north side of Chicago. But it too was connected to the loop, which meant even more train traffic. So the rail companies had to reopen their old terminals to short-term trains, and that worked for a while. But as Chicago grew, and with the aforementioned problems getting worse, Chicago needed more rail capacity in the central area. But between 1900 and 1943, there was no new capacity added into the loop. And this occurred during one of the highest growth seen in the city. In 1900, Chicago recorded around 1.7 million residents. By 1940, Chicago doubled its population to around 3.4 million people. So, why wasn't capacity expanded in the core during that time? Well, at the time, Chicago's subway company's finances weren't doing so hot.
The resources that were needed to make it happen, be it through private capital or otherwise, was sorely lacking. That is one of the reasons why you didn't see much happening. And then that also is what manifested the two world wars. We also had the Great Depression. You put all of those together, there was absolutely no resource or necessity or the political capital needed to address the expansion of the L as it was built.
Despite all this, there were attempts to build subways. The most notable was the 1923 Kelker Plan. In the plan, it recommended adding not one, not two, but three extra subways through downtown to help decongest the excessive traffic seen in the loop. And this plan had a major influence in Chicago politics. In the subsequent mayoral election in 1927, incumbent Mayor William Emmett Dever ran on building one of the subways as a top priority, the State Street Subway. However, Dever lost to William Hill Thompson in that election, and the dream of the State Street Subway died off.
If the political candidate that champions a particular idea loses the election, then that's going to be a non-starter. That idea is going to be a non-starter unless it is roundly approved by all quarters of the public.
But the dream of the subways lives on. By the 1930s, there was again an appetite to build the subways, including one on State Street. This time, though, Chicago was in luck. With the passage of the New Deal, there was now money to spend on transportation projects. So two subways from the 1923 Kelker Plan were funded. The aforementioned State Street Subway and the Milwaukee Dearborn Subway, the latter of which was a revised version of the Clark Street Subway. And just like New York City's I&D, planners envisioned subways to be a modern, high-capacity express line. To achieve that, there would be multiple factors. First, subways would take a shorter route than the L, with softer curves and fewer stations. And the stations were built to accommodate large crowds. Like here, in downtown, where three stations are continuously linked together. This provided an opportunity to stagger the trains to further increase capacity. But the most important aspect was the through running right through the core of Chicago. This allowed people from the north and south sides to be connected without changing trains. Simultaneously, this setup gave Chicago more value for their money. Instead of shifting only one train line away from the loop, Chicago could shift two train lines worth of capacity away using the same subway. Anyway, both subway projects started construction in 1938. The State Street Subway opened first, in 1943, while the Milwaukee Dearborn Subway opened in 1951, and both subways were a massive success and decongested the loop.
Here's a preview of the latest all-metal subway trains proposed for Chicago. Speedy and comfortable and stylish, too. Another notable achievement in promoting human as well as civic values for the I Will city. It's all aboard Chicago.
However, while the State Street and Milwaukee Dearborn subways were being built, planners weren't slacking off. Quite the opposite. Knowing that the subways were going to be revolutionary, planners began to imagine a world where the loop would be replaced with a series of subway lines.
The L was being looked upon as not very attractive. And also the fact that the subway systems were becoming very successful in alleviating congestion, there was a definitive movement towards building more of those, except the question of how much would it cost and then who will fund that was always going to be the question.
Enter the comprehensive plan for the extension of the subway system of the city of Chicago. Since that is a mouthful, I will call it the comprehensive plan from now on. Proposed in 1939, this plan would have radically reshaped Chicago transit.
And here's the comprehensive subway program, starting with the two routes now nearing completion. Route number 1, connecting with the South Side L near 14th Street, extends north in State Street, west in Division, and then in Clybourne to meet the North Side L near North Avenue. Route number 2 extends north in Dearborn Street from Van Buren, west in Lake Street, and then in Milwaukee Avenue to connect with the Logan Humboldt L near Paulina. A west side subway clear out to Laramie Avenue, and one in Lake Street to Racine Avenue are next on the schedule. And streetcar subways in Washington and Jackson from Clinton Street to Grant Park. Then a south and southwest subway in Wells Street, and out Archer and Ashland to 79th Street, and a northwest extension in Milwaukee Avenue to Foster. Later construction will add a South Park Avenue extension from the L to 79th Street. Crosstown subways on the near west side, subways in North and in Belmont Avenues, an extension to the airport, a Milwaukee Avenue Express subway, a Michigan Avenue connecting link. The part now being completed is 7 7/10 miles long. The master plan, not all for tomorrow, but as the ultimate objective, will provide a 54-mile subway system.
While the later phases of the plan never saw the light of day, it did serve as inspiration for future CTA attempts to replace the loop. Basically, the east side of the loop was served through the State Street in Milwaukee Dearborn subway. But the west side wasn't served by any subways, and east-west transit in the loop was served by streetcars, which were quickly being replaced by buses. Hence, in order to replace the loop, there needs to be a subway on the west side of downtown, plus some east-west distributors to supplement lost streetcar capacity in the loop. Fast forward 2 decades, that concept was replicated through the New Horizons for Chicago's Metropolitan Area Plan. Proposed in 1958, we again saw that concept established in the comprehensive plan, a west side subway plus an east-west distributor, specifically the Wells Street subway and a Jackson Boulevard distributor. While the plan did not explicitly call for demolishing the loop just yet, the plan mentioned that the Wells Street subway and the Jackson Boulevard distributor would make it possible to remove the entire loop elevated. But while many other projects inside New Horizons for Chicago's metropolitan area were funded, like the Congress Branch, Lake Street elevation, and the Northwest Subway extension, the new subways that were intended to replace the loop were not. After all, with limited funding, the CTA had to prioritize cheaper projects, like median expressway lines.
At that point in time, we are talking about a system that was becoming known as public transportation. It was no longer a privately operated venture. The bus companies were going into bankruptcy. The private rail companies were going into bankruptcy. CTA was also unable to meet costs. Now you have a situation where, on the flip side, the automobile becoming the dominant mode of transportation. You put all of these together, the governmental policies are supporting the extensive construction of road network. So there was not a lot of support for public transportation.
So the loop lives to fight another day. Except in 1962, planners were back. This time, instead of these simple subways, planners took that concept established in both of these plans and went an extra step. There would be a west side subway at LaSalle Street, but that was to be connected through a loop system. This loop system would cover more areas of downtown, while adding more capacity so that the Lake Street L and the proposed Dan Ryan branch could connect to it. While this plan went nowhere, this idea of a loop subway became the backbone of a future subway plan 6 years later. And that gets us to 1968, where planners once again revived the loop subway and east-west distributor concepts espoused in 1962. Now called the Chicago Central Area Transit Project, this plan would have a major influence in Chicago city planning for the next decade. So what were the details of the Chicago Central Area Transit Project? Well, of course, we got the Loop Subway, but this time running underneath Franklin, Van Buren, Randolph Streets, and Wabash Avenue. The Monroe Distributor would be kept and be extended north and south along Chicago's coastline. This was to serve the growing Chicago lakefront, which by now is dotted by a ton of high-rises. but there were massive protests against it. These protests, led by architect Harry Weiss, questioned the value of the project. He argued that no amount of subways can replace the historic infrastructure that is the Loop elevated, and that with just a bit of investment, the Chicago Loop could serve riders for the next 100 years. And he was not alone. Organizations such as the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Chicago Historic Society, the Society for Industrial Archaeology, and the National Association of Railroad Passengers all backed Weiss and his movement. However, the biggest opposition towards this new subway was money, or the lack thereof. The 1970s marked a period of high inflation. Costs soared, which caused many of these subway projects to be stuck in limbo. And it didn't help that federal funding, which was needed for the subway projects, became an elusive topic.
So it had to be earmarks. The earmarks, as we all know, is really based on the political capital that you have from a particular state at the highest level. So by the time Illinois and Chicago were able to orchestrate and get the support that they needed at the federal level to get the earmark for the subways or for the demolition of the L, they had let a lot of precious time lapse. It also was a reflection of who was in power, which party, and Chicago, as we all know, is traditionally supportive of democratic governments. I'm not talking about the rest of the state, but Chicago in particular. And in the 60s, you had Nixon. And then when Carter came to power, I think that is when the monies were realized for what they had been angling for. So by the time the monies were authorized and obligated, the costs had become prohibitively too big to act on what they had promised to do.
In order to rescue these projects being stuck in limbo, planners decided to scale them down. In 1974, the Loop concept was ditched, with only a subway on Franklin, a shortened Monroe distributor, and a small section on Randolph Street for the Lake Street L. But that was not enough to make up for the budget shortfalls. By 1976, the project was scaled back to only the Franklin Street subway and the Monroe Street distributor, the latter of which being connected to the Lake Street L. The rest of the Loop subway, called the balance of the project, would be built later. However, these waning subway plans received a temporary boost in support. In 1977, there was a Loop derailment, one of the most gruesome in the history of the CTA. While an internal report faulted human error, more people began to see the Loop as dangerously antiquated and must be replaced with subways. But with time, the old opposition of financing was back, and this time, hard. The temporary inflation cooldown in the mid-1970s was over, and with inflation reaching double digits by 1978, the already meager 1976 revisions was once again scaled down to only the Franklin Street subway by 1977. And even that was not enough. So in 1979, with an agreement between the mayor and the governor, the Loop subway project was canceled, with funding being earmarked towards other extensions and improvements. The Loop was basically saved from a lack of money. Had the money came at the right place at the right time, we could have been looking at a Chicago downtown that is very different.
In a way, it was a fortuitous failure. That's the way I would look at it, because the L still is an attraction to speak of. Nobody targets the L and says it's an eyesore. They tend to look at the L as fondly, as a relic of a bygone era. And it seems to be functioning, right? None of the delays or reliability issues on the CTA system are attributed to the L. So it has worked out in a way. But if you want to attribute any factors as to why the L was not brought down, it is just that the earmarks didn't appear on time.
However, the work did not end there. For one, the Chicago Loop, just like every line, was suffering from deferred maintenance. The stations were falling apart. the track quality was non-existent. And to top it off, there was no integration between the subway lines and the loop, which meant out-of-system transfers. So very quickly, money came to fix the loop. And ironically, the money intended to replace the loop were reallocated to projects that saved the loop. It started with track upgrades, as decades of wear and tear have effectively worn out the rails. There were also station upgrades, like here at Quincy. These station upgrades increased the station capacity, while still giving its old retro charm. It also presented an opportunity to add elevators, making the stations compliant with the ADA.
The other aspect that I would point to is the passing of the ADA, which was very, very seminal in my opinion, because the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then in a way, Illinois and Chicago were ahead of the ADA mandate because of another lawsuit that happened in the late 80s pertaining to people with disabilities and access to the CTA system, I believe. And so a lot of the stations that were being reconstructed were being ADA compliant, and the ones that were closed were because of other factors pertaining to ridership and consolidation. And so you had this really good upkeep of the loop infrastructure that was much needed.
Work also started on creating in-system transfers between the loop and the subway. In 1992, the loop's Clarkin Lake station was finally connected to the subway's Clarkin Lake station. Using a portion of two buildings, this was the loop's first in-system transfer connection to the subway. There was also the repositioning of stations on the loop. The first one happened between 1994 and 1995, where Randolph and Madison were closed. A replacement at Washington was opened in between the former two stations. This helped with stop spacing while building a spacious station for the 21st century. Another repositioning of stations happened on the State Street subway. While not on the loop, Washington on the State Street subway was separated into Lake and Washington in 1996. This was to provide a better connection to the loop, as State and Lake was one of the biggest transfer points in the system. But the new Lake station lacks the in-system transfer that Clarkin Lake has. The addition of Harold Washington Library Station, or then called State and Van Buren, on the south side of the loop allowed for better transfers to Jackson on both the State Street and Milwaukee Dearborn subways. And just like Washington and Wells, the station is built as a high-capacity station, though it again misses the in-system transfer component that Clarkin Lake has. Finally, work started on modernizing all the lines coming into the loop.
So we've addressed the green, brown, and orange is a new one, and the pink is a new one. The red-purple modernization is another effort that is underway. So if you get that done, now your red line slow zones are going to be taken care of, as well as the northern part of the red line branch, which is also the trackage that is shared with the purple line. So now you have red and purple taken care of, which also alleviates some of the issues associated with the yellow line. The only one that will need significant infusion of funds will be the blue line.
But those were the physical changes. And while that is important so that your entire system isn't infested with slow zones and have stations that look like this, Chicago was changing in the 80s and 90s. So on top of the physical changes, there were many operational changes added to the loop to better fit ridership patterns. Yet those changes were sometimes controversial. Let's start south, here at Dan Ryan. Trains were packed here, and because it was connected to the loop, where it had to share tracks with other lines, a limited capacity on the Dan Ryan branch. There was also an imbalance problem, where the Dan Ryan branch was connected to the Lake Street L, which was not heavily used. This was inefficient. One side is crush loaded, and the other side is empty. The solution was to realign the Dan Ryan with the State Street subway. Combined with further improvements, this would have nearly de-interlined the Dan Ryan branch, allowing trains to be run every 2 to 3 minutes instead of every 5 to 7 minutes, increasing capacity by more than 100%. This would have also made operations far more efficient, as the Dan Ryan would have been connected to the north side main line, which was heavily used. This meant that both ends of the line would be efficiently used. So the plan was presented to the community, and they hated it. Many riders wanted the one-seat ride between the west and south sides. However, despite the different tactics, including a last-minute letter to then-Mayor Richard M. Daley, the project proceeded. And in 1993, the project was completed, and the realignment was made permanent. But this project was not completed in a vacuum. Because the Dan Ryan branch was no longer connected to the loop, and its replacement, the Southside L, was never as intensely used, this created some excess capacity. This was perfect for a new line, the Orange Line. This new line connected Midway Airport to the loop, while also serving one of the largest transit deserts in Chicago, the Southwest area, and opened in 1993. However, the loop ridership realignment was not complete in 1993. By the 2000s, interest turned towards the Cermak branch, a former branch line of the Blue Line, a poorly maintained branch line. By the turn of the millennium, the Douglas Park branch, now called the Cermak branch, was in dire need of repair. Around 47% of the line was designated as slow zones. These slow zones contributed to a 50% decrease in ridership. As a result, there was no weekend service, and the Cermak branch was the least used branch on the Blue Line, at 9,000 riders daily. For reference, the Congress branch today sees 12,000 riders, and that line has a ton of issues. So in 2001, a new project was launched to fix the Cermak branch, and it went by smoothly, finishing in 2005. But what was interesting is that in 2004, it was reported that the CTA was studying rerouting all Cermak branch trains away from the Blue Line and the Milwaukee-Dearborn subway, and routing it to the Lake Street L in the loop. The reasoning given was to add more service to the Cermak branch and to give more one-seat rides, as the Fulton Market area was booming. However, just like the realignment of the red and green lines, this plan of severing connection with the Blue Line was controversial. Cermak branch riders complained about losing even more service and losing direct service to the northwest side, and they won the initial battle, as that plan was paused thanks to the CTA's prioritizing restoring weekend service with the limited funds that they had. But after weekend service was restored, the CTA continued where they left off, and the opposition returned. So the CTA made a ton of concessions, like increasing some bus service, while also making the new connection a trial run. With these concessions, the CTA introduced the Pink Line in 2006, adding our final line to the loop. And I would say the introduction of the Pink Line is a relative success.
For what it's worth, it has had significant economic impact on the neighborhoods that it is passing through. Fulton Market, that I said was dead and dusted back in the 90s, wouldn't be what it is now without the Pink Line and the Morgan Station. So a lot of the economic revitalization of the neighborhoods has been tied to the Pink Line. So from that perspective, I would call it a win for CTA.
Coming into the 2010s, there was only one more change to the loop: Washington and Wabash. First proposed in 1981, it would have replaced Randolph and Washington nearby. But it was delayed continuously until finally in 2013, when all of the planning and funding problems were resolved. Construction began in 2015, and Washington and Wabash opened in 2017, making it the newest station on the loop. And that brings us to the present day. So, what is next? Well, there is reconstruction of State and Lake, set to happen in the 2020s. And this is sorely needed, as this is the last station that has received any renovation work. But it does beg the question, should State and Lake have an in-system transfer to the subway?
The State and Lake, while a good idea, as you alluded to, the footprint that you might need for a superstation may not be there. At what cost is always the question that I ask. But that's just a personal opinion, right? New is always going to be very attractive.
Anyway, when the reconstruction of State and Lake happens, and the loop is in relatively good condition, it does beg another question. As Chicago moves away from a radial model to a more circumferential model of transit, what's the future of the loop? Well, obviously, the loop will still be very important. After all, that is how 5 lines enter downtown, and where a plurality of the jobs are located. But as Chicago grows in circumferential destinations, it is clear that a second loop line is needed. But where should it go? Hi, and thank you so much for watching this video. I do want to mention 2 things. First, I do want to extend a thank you to Dr. Sriraj for agreeing to do this interview, and to Mr. Berry for helping to organize the interview. Second, I do want to thank Hudson and everyone else who donated for getting Queenslink over $100,000. Once again, thank you. Every dollar will go towards countering the MTA's flawed analysis on the Rockaway Beach branch. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.